We have the privilege to have a conversation with Mrs. Beata Javorcik, Chief Economist in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Mrs. Javorcik, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Mrs. Javorcik, we're living in a very turbulent era. We saw yesterday Iran attacking Israel in an escalation in the Middle East, and the whole world is expecting now for the retaliations of Israel against Iran. In its recent report, OECD says that persistent geopolitical tensions is a key risk for the global economy, which is still under restrictive monetary policy from ECB. What is your outlook after the Iranian attack in Israel yesterday, and what are the big risks for European economy now, Mrs. Javorcik?
Escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, of course, would have very tragic consequences for the people in the region. It also would have economic implications for the whole economy. The conflict, its escalation, could potentially lead to much higher oil prices, and that would reignite inflationary pressures at the time when we are just coming out from the latest episode of disinflation. There is also broader turbulence in the world, and the process of disintegration that has started a while ago. There was Brexit, the US-China trade war, then sanctions on Russia. So there's a danger of the global economy finding itself on a path to fragmentation, breaking into two rival geopolitical blocs. Now, many observers have pointed out the economic cost of such fragmentation, but there's another cost. This fragmentation could lead to slowing down of the process of green transition, because escalation of geopolitical tensions could lead China, which controls a large chunk of production of critical raw materials, to introduce export restrictions. So in Europe, we may find ourselves cut off from the minerals and metals that we need to proceed with the green transition process.
And this is a big issue. Let me stay a little bit more in the oil markets, because you said that this is the big fear now. We see that they are already nervous, and we have some prices jump already. Do you think that there is a risk? You already said that there is a risk for resurgence of inflation from this geopolitical instability in the Middle East. But let me ask you, what would be the worst case scenario? Could we see the oil in prices like $100 per barrel?
Well, I don't want to paint here a very dark picture, but I think any resurgence in oil prices would be painful for Europe. In Europe, we are already facing very high prices of natural gas. They are 5 times as high as prices in the United States. The Draghi report pointed out that electricity prices in Europe are 2 to 3 times as high as in the United States. So an additional increase in energy prices would be very painful for Europe, both for its industry as well as for households.
I will come to Draghi report because it's very interesting. But before that, I would like to ask you about big economies in Europe like France and Germany are flirting already with recession or are facing excessive deficit process from the EU. Competitiveness of the European economy is being hurt by expensive energy and is losing ground to China and the United States. I would like to ask you, are you worried about the European economy and what we must expect? And recently, EBRD released an updated report revising downwards the 2024 growth prospects for many countries. Is that the case for Greece as well?
So many questions here.
Many questions.
So let me start with our report. So we have trimmed our forecast for regions where we operate, and that's for several reasons. First one is weakness in external demand. In particular, slump in Western Europe means lower demand for exports from Eastern Europe, from North Africa. Second, even though a lot of progress has been made in fighting inflation, and actually the disinflation process in emerging Europe has been very fast by historical standards, interest rates remain elevated. They are actually in many countries higher than what they were at the time of peak inflation. And third, many countries in our regions have experienced adverse weather events. So I'm talking here about severe droughts in Tunisia and Morocco, spells of extremely cold weather in Mongolia. So there are factors which have led us to trimming of the forecast. Now, when it comes to Greece, the Greek economy is actually a bright spot, and for Greece we have upped our forecast by a small amount. Growth in your country is faster than in the Eurozone. Economic sentiment is much stronger, much better than in the Eurozone. And the tourism season has started very strong. Now, on top of that, Greece regained investment grade status in 2023, so investment flows are reviving a bit. And you have a government with a reform mandate as well as access to generous EU funding.
So, since you spoke about the Greek economy, I will go to this question now. And we have an economy that outperforming other European economies with growth of over 2%. However, we have a persistent inflation here as well, and this is the biggest problem for households and businesses. Where do you identify the biggest areas of concern for the Greek economy, if there are any? And do you think that Greece has overcome the risks of the past 10 years of the debt crisis?
Greek economy and Greek households are still feeling the legacy of the debt crisis. On top of that, there was this recent bout in inflation caused by supply shortages during COVID. And then Europe was hit by the energy shock. So it's not surprising that Greek households are seeing their purchasing power eroded and they are feeling the pinch. However, let me put things into a broader perspective, or maybe midterm perspective. The big picture is that now Greece is facing a window of opportunity. So on the one hand, you have a stable government with a public mandate to reform the economy. And it's a government that has intention to undertake reforms, whether it's judiciary, whether it's red tape, whether it's infrastructure, improvement to business climate. And on the other hand, you have access to very generous European financing. Financing that is directed at particular areas, green transformation, digitalization. So financing that is not going to current consumption, but rather financing that's intended to lay foundations for future growth. And that's something that's typically difficult for governments to do, because governments need to show at the next election what they have achieved. Exactly. So here the EU is tying the hands of governments and forcing them to invest in long-term growth. So these two factors create a chance for Greece to put itself on a faster growth trajectory.
So, since we are in the Greek economy area, one of the greatest weaknesses of the Greek economy is competitiveness. How can we increase the competitiveness of Greece? And EBRD has invested in Greece. Are you happy with these projects you have funded so far? And where do you focus your interest now?
Well, we have an agreement with the Ministry of Finance to support utilization of RRF funds by extending debt, by extending loans to projects under RRF framework. And we, in particular, are interested in projects that increase competitiveness of the Greek economy, we have, for instance, supported extension of broadband to households. We have supported firms in various parts of manufacturing industries. We are also supporting green transformation. So we are very glad to help Greece utilize the RRF funding. And actually, Greece is one of the countries that has so far been most successful in bringing EU money to its economy.
So we're in a good path in this way.
Absolutely.
So let's go back to Mario Draghi's proposal, who is in his recent report on the European economy proposed the issuance of common debt Eurobonds for the necessary investments to accelerate the green transition and close the gap between Europe and China and the United States. The report adopts, we could say, the proposal of a group of states, including Greece, who requests a recovery fund volume 2, a new RRF. Do you think that Europe needs a new recovery fund and a common economic policy with the issuance of Eurobonds and common debt?
Well, the Draghi report was very sobering. It pointed out that the current challenges, the current economic slump in Europe is not something cyclical. It's not due to the fallout from the war, but that Europe has a longer-term structural problems linked to it losing competitiveness vis-à-vis the United States. And that's this realization how far we are in Europe in terms of productivity growth, how far we are behind the United States, has shaken up the European establishment.
That was the goal, I think.
That was the goal, and you know, the gravitas, the respect Mario Draghi enjoys means that his message has been taken seriously. He also pointed out that a tsunami of regulation has swept through Europe, and even if each of these individual regulations is well-meaning, their sheer number constitutes a significant compliance cost for firms, particularly for smaller firms. And again, that erodes European competitiveness. So I think Mario Draghi has created this feeling in Europe that it's now or never. We need to do something. Now, the recipes differ. I think everybody realizes that we need to invest, but different countries have a different view in terms of how should it be done, whether this should be done at the European level or at the level of the individual countries.
So let me ask you about the green transition. It's the most ambitious goal of Europe and the whole world. However, there are voices that they say it is expensive and the cost will ultimately be borne by the citizens. The recent Draghi report, among many others, also refers to the necessity of affordable energy prices for consumers so that the reduction in prices due to renewable energy prices is passed to households and businesses. I would like to ask you, is the green transition ultimately expensive and who should pay for it?
Well, the mistake people make when thinking about green transition is that they think of business as usual as the alternative, right? But we are not in the world where business as usual can continue.
We're not there.
Because climate change is with us, and Greece has experienced adverse weather events that seem to have become more frequent. So the world will be different, and the costs of dealing with those extreme level events are something that people are not taking into account when thinking about green transition. I think policymakers have not done a good enough job having a conversation with the electorate about green transition. Costs are one of the issues. Another issue is the adjustment, the fact that green transition will necessitate big changes to the economy, and that people will need to change jobs, as some sectors like coal mining will disappear, as not all companies will be able to adjust to a greener future. Actually, we did a survey in Greece and many other countries, and we asked people, do you believe that climate change is real? Are you concerned about environment? And 3/4 of people say yes. In Greece and in other places, yes, climate change is real. It's going to affect us, our children. Now, when you pose the question as an economic trade-off, should government prioritize environment over jobs? Or are you willing to pay more taxes so that the government can fight green transition? Enthusiasm evaporates. And in Greece, as in many other countries, only about 1/3 of people say yes. They are willing to bear the cost. Now, when you look at who are the people who believe that climate change is real, but they are not willing to bear the cost? Typically, these are people without university education and people in the bottom half of earning distribution. So these are people for whom retraining, finding an alternative profession will be more difficult. These are people for whom this period of adjustment, of finding a new job would be harder because they don't have the savings cushion. So these are the people whom governments need to reassure that they would be taken care of, that they would get assistance during that time.
Yes, but this is a fact in Europe. Do the governments do that?
Well, the governments have not done a good enough job explaining this. And you know, when I may come back to the budgetary issues, we find ourselves in a situation where there are lots of demand on government budgets. Many countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, are spending more on defense. The cost of borrowing, particularly in emerging Europe, has gone up as they are paying a higher risk premium since the time the war in Ukraine started. And then, you know, they are facing the cost of green transition. They are facing the calls for cushioning households from high energy prices. And there is the Draghi report, which talks about investments that would lay foundation for future competitiveness. So I think, you know, we need to have a very serious conversation at the European level about how to deal with all these challenges that are coming at us simultaneously.
Mrs. Javorcik, thank you very much for this interesting conversation.
Thank you for having me.